In this week's Trench Chat, we're joined by military historian Taff Gillingham to talk about his exciting project, Great War Huts. Welcome to another Trench Chat. I'm really pleased this week to be joined by military historian and all-round good egg, Taff Gillingham. Welcome, Taff.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be invited.
Well, you and I are of a very similar age. We won't say what that age is, but I think we've both sort of grown up with military history, really, and in particular, the Great War. Where did it really all start for you?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, being that, as you say, that age, growing up making model soldiers, it was action men, it was, war comics, and being surrounded by people who'd fought in both world wars. I mean, even though he died before I was born, my dad's dad, my grandfather, he'd served in the First World War in Palestine and in France. My mum's dad had been a pattern moulder in a foundry, so he'd had a reserved occupation. My dad's mum had left school at 14 to work in a munitions factory. So all of these stories were sort of bumbling around. You look back now and you think all the stories that, all the questions I should have asked when I was really young. But everybody around you just had these stories, these little snippets, and it just, I suppose, really just built that interest. And at quite a young age, I started collecting uniforms and equipment. And that, whilst it sort of came and went, as an interest, it would be, I'd go through a phase of it and then I'd sort of get interested in something else, but it never really went away. And then in the late 80s, I bumped into a bunch of fellas who went on and eventually became the Khaki Chums, who were collectors. I mean, amongst them, they were experts on all sorts of aspects of British military history. And the Chums, that was really all about a learning experience. The Chums weren't really, they weren't a reenactment group or a living history group, really. It was a fairly selfish organisation, where we would go to France, Belgium, Holland, or whatever, and dressed in all the kit for units of either of the two world wars, so that we could have an understanding. How is it worn? It says in the manuals that this is how the kit should be worn. You look at the photographs and nobody wears it like that. Well, you put it on, you get it. You go, well, it's much more comfortable like this. It's more practical. And that ended up as a sort of a 30-year-long learning experience, which really then led on pretty much to everything else. It led on to doing talks for schools. It led on to film and television work, and ultimately led on to Great War Huts, the project that which is what we're involved in now.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit more about that. It's a new project you've been working on with actual original Great War Huts. That's the name, I suppose.
Well, that's right. Yes, and it's accidental. I mean, it is we always say it's our accidental First World War heritage project. And it came about really because we started a company back in 2001 to supply uniforms, equipment, weapons and props for film and television theatre work. And as part of that, we've got a trench system on the outskirts of Ipswich, where people like Downton Abbey or the Journey's End film or documentaries, dramas, all sorts, come to film their first war epics. And every time that we'd worked on a big project, something like Downton Abbey, we would be inundated with people saying, oh, can I bring the school? Can I bring the Women's Institute? Can I bring the kids? Can I just come and have a look? And you couldn't do that because it only had planning permission for film work. And not just that, because whereas, as you know, with a proper trench, it's full of right angles to limit blast damage. But what we'd done for television, those angles we'd opened out just to give you better sight lines for cameras. So if you came, you wouldn't see a First World War trench system, you'd see a film set. So we thought what we ought to do is find a site where we could build a proper First World War visitors centre where people could come and learn, because clearly there was an interest in it, there was a thirst for it. And what was most important, what was quite inspiring about it, was that the people who were asking were the people who weren't already obsessively interested like us. And I thought, well, there's something in this. And we looked for several years. I mean, I think it was 5, 6 years, maybe longer, to try and find a site which would work. And eventually we found Brook Farm here at Horsted, 4.5 acres in the middle of the Suffolk countryside, far enough away from busy main roads, not surrounded by pylons or modern infrastructure, because nobody thinks that they've been transported back in time 100 years. But if there's a pylon on the horizon that's sort of poking you in the eye, it just spoils that illusion. And it could have been purpose made for the job. The moment you drive in the gate, there was a meadow, which was obviously going to be the car park. There was a big farm building, which was big enough to put the uniform and equipment business in. There was a lovely old Victorian barn, which was perfect sense to make that the reception area. You could put some toilets on one side, a cafe on the back. And at that stage, there was a completely out of place row of Leylandii trees, which screened the rest of the site. But beyond it, there was a sort of flat, gently sloping plateau, which sat in a little river valley. There was a field and a drop, this little plateau, then a river. And we thought, well, that's big enough. We could put some replica First World War Army huts in there to put displays in, have a big one for exhibitions or a lecture theatre. And beyond that, there was plenty of room to build trenches, which stretched off into the distance, down into the woods. There's an area of woodland at the end. And as I say, there's a little river that runs through the site with enough room on the opposite side of the river to build a picnic area, which got you away from it. And we thought, well, this is perfect. So we bought it. We then went to see St Edmundsbury Planning Department. And the head of St Edmundsbury Planning said, you won't get planning permission on this in a million years, but why don't you play the planning game? You might get lucky. And we're gamblers, but we're not that big of gamblers. So we thought, well, we really need to get some help here. We need to get somebody that actually knows what they're talking about, who can help us. And the Durand group, the crazy bunch that go underneath the Western Front, they explore all the tunnels that the tunnels built. I'd been over a couple of times with them and stayed at Nick Pryor's place. Nick was the secretary in those days. I mean, he might still be, I can't remember. And I knew that Nick was something to do with planning. So I spoke to Dave Hedges, a mutual friend, and said, what does Nick do in the planning world? And he said, oh, well, nothing that would be of any use to you. Nick's the fellow when Sainsbury's or Tesco's want to build over an area of outstanding natural beauty, they go to Nick's company and Nick explains to the local planners why they can't stop them. So I thought, well, I'll give him a ring and see. So I rang Nick up and he said, oh, this sounds wonderful. I love the idea. I'll come and have a look. And he spent a whole day with us. He walked the entire area. He photographed everything. And at the end of the afternoon, we sat down in front of the barn with a cup of tea. And he said, I will get you planning permission on this. It won't be cheap. You'll have to cross every T. You'll have to dot every I. But if you do everything that I tell you to do, in theory, there's no reason at all why your planning permission would be refused. So over the next few months, an enormous sum of money, bats and badger surveys, traffic surveys, landscape surveys, we mail shotted the entire village. We're here at Horsted in Suffolk, and said, we'd like you to come and have a look. We'd like you to meet us, because right from the start, we'd made it clear, we'd been to parish council meetings and said, we don't want to be squatters. We want to be part of village life. We want to help, and obviously since then we've contributed to defibrillator funds, and we play our part. We're definitely part of the village life here now. So we did all of those things, and when it finally came to the planning meeting, anybody that's ever been to a planning meeting, it's the place where people's hopes and dreams all go to die, and one after the other you see people's planning applications crashing and burning, and ours was the last one of the day. And it was the only one of the day which was passed unanimously. In fact, the planning department had said that we wouldn't be able to open through the winter, and a member of the planning committee said, well, this is ridiculous. If this is about rural tourism development and it's about education, there's no reason why it can't be open all year if you want it to be. So that was great. One of the other planning conditions was that we could only have one coach a day, and somebody else on the planning committee said, well, that's ridiculous as well. We can limit it to one coach a time, but if you could get 4 or 5 a day, well, that's marvellous. So not only did we get the planning permission, we came out of the meeting with a better deal than the one we were expecting. So that was quite remarkable. And at that stage, as I said earlier, it was the intention was to build replica army huts, because the plans were available. We'd got copies of Major Armstrong's plans for Armstrong huts and the others. And then, just by a complete quirk of fate, I have a monthly radio interview with Leslie Dolphin, who's a presenter on BBC Radio Suffolk. And something we'd been talking about just sparked off a memory that I'd read that the Ipswich Society, who are a great local organisation who try and look after old buildings and promote interest in Ipswich heritage, they had written in their newsletter that the Ipswich Labour Club had an 8-year battle to get rid of an old wooden hut to build a new function room. And I had no idea. There and then, as I left Radio Suffolk, I thought, just in my mind, I thought, I wonder what that old wooden hut is. So I went right into the centre of Ipswich, right in the middle of Ipswich town centre, and turned into the car park, and there sat a double hut. It was a recreation hut, which turned out to have been built by the army at Colchester, probably mid-war, late war. It was actually 2 barrack huts that had been joined together with a stage at one end, for entertainment for soldiers. I found the club secretary and I said, "Oh, I hear you've had a bit of a battle to get rid of this." "Oh, yes, 8 years it's taken us to get rid of this damn thing. It's an absolute nightmare, and it really is." I said, "Oh," I said, and I don't suppose it would be very cheap to get rid of it." "Oh, we've been quoted £8,000 to get rid of the damn thing, you know." And of course, at that moment, I should have said, "Well, we'll do it for 5." But at that moment, instead, I said, "Well, if we offered to take it for free, could we have it?" He said, "Well, why on earth would you do that?" And I explained what we were doing. He said, "That's marvellous." And he said, "We'll have to run it past the committee." And of course, the committee were delighted. So in the July and August of 2014, we arranged to take it down. I mean, and at this point, I have to mention Kev Smith, my business partner at Khaki Devil, who was he was an aircraft engineer originally, working for Marshall's Aerospace, and back in the 1970s. He was member number 19 of Duxford Aviation Society, and an incredibly clever engineer. He really is. There's a project like this. You couldn't do a project like this if you didn't have a Kev Smith. But I'd said to Kev, "Look, you need to come and have a look at this hut." And he just walked in the door and he just looking around. Yeah, I can see how they've built this. Yeah, I know how I'm going to take this down. Without any plans or design. So over those couple of months, we took it down. Brought it back to Brook Farm, and in the barn that first winter, in the leaky, freezing cold barn, Kevin, a young lad called Harry, who worked for us then, restored all the panels. It was made in 6-foot panels, and the roof was in 6-foot panels as well. And then the following spring, we then put it back up again. And of course, the moment that you come into contact with real buildings, real artifacts, you're like, why did we ever think of using replicas? Because the whole thing just oozes history. Everything about it, the moment you walk in the door, you know that this had been filled with First War soldiers or sailors or airmen or women. And it's not only the First War history, which are obviously fascinating, but all of them have had a long history after the First War. I mean, very often the social history is every bit as interesting, sometimes more interesting than the First War history. I mean, the Labour Club itself, that recreation hut, as I say, it got a stage at one end, and the club secretary said, "Are you going to save the stage, or will you rebuild it?" And I said, "Well, we haven't decided yet." And he was sort of a bit wistful. He said, I remember this as a boy." He said, they were just around the corner from the old Ipswich Hippodrome, which was the sort of major music hall and entertainment centre. And he said, every Sunday, whichever sort of was the act of the week, all the musical turns or the stars of the day would come and put on a free show at Ipswich Labour Club. And he went through this great long list of famous Arthur Askies and George Formby's and goodness knows what else, who'd all performed on that very stage. And well, clearly, then then it needed to be saved, and obviously we now have it here. So we suddenly realised that this was accidentally, we suddenly find ourselves in the middle of a major heritage project. And of course, at the outset, you make all sorts of assumptions. Oh, all army huts will be the same. People refer to them as Armstrong huts because in August 1914, Major Armstrong of the Royal Engineers was given the task of designing something like 32 different buildings, which in any combination could be a battalion camp, a brigade camp, an aerodrome, a rifle range, a cavalry barracks. But what you suddenly realise quite quickly is that there are all sorts of variations, because clearly other companies were popping up saying, well, we already make temporary wooden buildings as mission churches, and we send these all over the world. I mean, a lot of the Wild West, a lot of the towns in the Wild West were built in temporary form as temporary buildings and shipped out there and assembled, a lot of them from Britain. So that technology, that experience already existed. So you find all sorts of variations. Some huts were built by the soldiers themselves. One of the early ones that we took down, because having got the first hut, we get some publicity. The local news, Look East in Suffolk here, and the local radio, newspapers. They ran the story, and within seconds, the phone starts ringing. "Oh, hello, we're Great Hawksley Women's Institute. We've got a hut. It's a bit of a millstone. Will you take it away?" "Oh, hello, my mum's just died. She's been living in one. Would you like that?" "Oh, yeah. Shall I come tomorrow?" "Oh, no, that's mum's funeral. You better come the day after." And it was like this for months. And so we went to the one at Tring, which was looking quite sorry for itself. And I think probably now, with the experience we've got, we would probably walk away and leave it where it was. But it was fascinating. It had originally been 120 foot long. It was built by the London Territorial Gunners at Gadebridge Park at Hemel Hempstead, who'd had a terrible first winter under canvas in a sea of liquid mud, and said, "Right, stuff this, we're going to build our own camp. And it was built by the gunners themselves. When they went to France, it became an army VD hospital, as many of them did. In 1918, the commanding officer of the hospital shot himself because he'd had a review from the local brigade commander who said, "This is by far the worst venereal disease hospital I've ever come across." So you've got all these fascinating little bits of history. And after the war, it was bought by a local mill owner in Tring, who'd taken it back to Tring and had it reassembled as a church and a church hall, a combined church and church hall. And by the time we rescued it, one end had nearly all gone. The church end had nearly all been shortened as it had rotted away over the years. But what was fascinating was the amount of people, as we were taking it down, who would just turn up and say, "Oh, I got married, when I got married, we had our wedding reception here. Oh, we had my baby's christening party, or I remember this or that." And you suddenly realize how important a lot of these buildings had been to local communities, and still are. I mean, because again, as we started to research them, you start to look for them, people start telling you about them. And something that we, at the outset, you think, well, there can't be many of these left. There were thousands of them. There were so many of them originally, and so many of them are still doing that job as village halls, as scout huts, as houses. A lot of people still living in them. And so as part of the project, we then set up a sort of a sideline called Love Your Hut, where if you've got a hut and you need a bit of help with it, if you want a bit of advice, some villages have reached that stage where half the village are saying, "Oh, we need to pull it down and buy a new one," and the other half are saying, "Oh, we love it, we want to keep it." Well, very often we've been able to give people advice as to how to look after it and improve it, and without spending too much money, you can give them another lease of life, and really, if you look after it, it'll last another 100 years. So it's been fascinating. We've had people come here literally from all over the world. We've been helping other projects, the Ballykindler Camp project, where they've just built a replica Armstrong hut for a project they're doing. There are teams of archaeologists that are studying camps, the sites of camps. I mean, I think the Leeds Pals camp, the footings of that are all still there. So we had some of the team speaking to us about, well, we found this sort of weird combination of concrete blocks. What could this possibly have been? And because we've got the plans for the camp, so it's, oh, well, that's probably a drying room or something like that. We've had the National Trust here from Belton Park because they'd got the chance of an original hut from obviously the machine gun corps school. So it's been fascinating, and it's not fashionable. I mean, if we were restoring aeroplanes or if we were restoring tanks or steam engines, there'd be a lot more support. I mean, they're wooden huts, but it's the starting point, because once we've built the huts, then the contents, the exhibits that go in them, that's the stage we need to get to. That's when it'll get really interesting. But this is important. This is we've discovered that there is this whole fascinating study here. That there are plenty of different types. You can see how they evolved from Armstrong's original heavily over-engineered, massive timbers, huge trusses, to by the end of the war, the tiniest amounts of timber. Clearly, the ministry turn up with a clipboard and say, right, what's the minimum amount of timber that will hold the roof up, because we're wasting wood. So at every step, you can see how these changes occur, all of which we're recording. And I think that the other thing that nobody really appreciates is that when the war broke out, the British Army could accommodate about 150,000 soldiers in this country in brick barracks. And when Kitchener asked for 100,000 volunteers and 1 million men turn up, then there's a massive crisis. And there's soldiers, as you know, who are just in private houses, they're in breweries, they're in town halls, they're in factories, which is a massive problem in its own right, because in the morning you've got to gather all these people up, you've got to feed them and then take them somewhere to train them, and then reverse that process at the end of the day. So you're losing several hours in order to do that. It was very important to sort that situation out and get the accommodation sorted. So that building project, in those few months at the end of 1914 and the beginning of 1915, where they built enough wooden accommodation, enough wooden hutted accommodation for 800,000 men, to this day remains the largest building project in British history. There's nothing before it or since that comes close to it, and probably never will now. And no one's told that story, along with the whole of that mobilisation, the whole of that massive process of creating the citizen army. It's a crucial part of that, and that's something we're telling here.
It's fascinating. I mean, these huts are tangible connections to the First World War, and as you've described, they sort of took on a life beyond the war, and through you, it sounds as if they're getting a new life again.
Well, that's the thing, because as I say, I mean, to begin with, we'd just seen them as boxes that we were going to put exhibits in. That's well, it's about the stuff, it's about the things, it's about the uniforms, the weapons, the artifacts. But then you realise, well, the huts themselves are artifacts. They do tell that story, and you can show how that. And if you're not interested, it doesn't matter. You can just look at the artifacts, but you can see that evolution. You can see how they go from that very heavily over-engineered, covered in corrugated iron, which of course very quickly they realise, well, that would be much more use making other things. So they go to wood quite quickly, and you can see the whole of that process, and the fact that they've survived 100 years. Clearly, I mean, there are houses that were built in the 1970s that they're already pulling down. These wooden huts, that survived 100 years. I mean, funnily enough, the best one we've got was Girton Women's Institute near Cambridge. We had a telephone call from the ladies there who said, we're no longer using our WI hall. We're now in a nice new building, although sharing the village hall, and the site is being sold. It's going to become sort of housing for young local people who could never afford to live here otherwise. And it's got to go. We've offered it to the Imperial War Museum, who don't want it. And actually, Alan Wakefield contacted me as well and said, we've been offered this. And at the time, we were quite busy. Kev and Harry were already working on another one. I think it was the British Legion Club from Stoke by Nayland, which was quite an interesting hut in its own right. And I said, well, I'll just go and have a look. So I drove over and I met the ladies from the WI and had a good look around it. I thought, well, this is quite interesting, because normally there are bits of them that are in quite bad order. But there really wasn't much. It looked pretty sound, and some of the corrugated tin on the outside, the original corrugated tin, I was able to lift parts of that and look underneath the windows where they often rot. And I think, well, there's really not a lot of damage here. So I said to Kev, I think you need to come and have a look at this. So he came and had a look and said, yeah, actually, we do need to save this. This is very good. So they stopped working on the other hut, and we started dismantling it. And the Girton Women's Institute had bought it in 1920 from Cherry Hinton Hospital, which was an Army VD hospital. There's a theme forming here.
Recurring theme there.
And I mean, that had got fascinating history in its own right. There are newspaper press reports where the local people had been demanding, during the war, that it had been surrounded by barbed wire, so these diseased soldiers couldn't get out and mix with the local population. And at the end of the war, in 1919, the Cambridge City Council said, look, it's a ready-made housing estate. It's got water laid on, it's got comfortable buildings, it's got electricity. And the locals were like, nope, you can take your VD hospital and you can get rid of it. So the whole lot was sold off. And as I say, Girton Women's Institute bought theirs in 1920. In fact, we know pretty much when, because the original matchboarding on the inside, when we took that off, one of the panels had been signed by the husband of the original WI chairman in November 1920, when he'd been nailing it all back together again. So we can pretty much pin down exactly when it went back up. And so we start stripping it. We start getting the tin off one end. Oh no, the wooden matchboard on the inside. We start stripping the inside of one end. And we're posting these pictures on the Great War Hut's Facebook page, because actually Great War Hut's Facebook page has been great. It's the most active. It's the place where you get a lot of interaction with people. If you're looking for old roofing nails or something like that, you put a note on there and somebody somewhere will go and have a rummage in Grandad's shed and produce some. So it's been a great resource as well. But it's the place where we show the progress, we show the work we're doing. And so we posted these pictures of us stripping the wood off the inside of this hut. And I had a message from an American lady called Carrie Draper. And Carrie was an architecture student at Cambridge University. And her PhD thesis was on temporary British wooden buildings of the two world wars. And why wouldn't they? It's just wonderful. And she said, oh my goodness, that's an Armstrong hut, isn't it? And I must admit, because we'd just been stripping it and you're this close to it, we haven't even noticed. But it confirmed exactly to Armstrong's drawings. And actually, Armstrong huts aren't that common, because everyone says, oh, they're all Armstrongs. But very clearly, the majority were different types. And as the war progresses, they become much more simplified. In Armstrong's original form, it was built as a timber frame and then it was clad. The later ones are built in sections that you can bolt together, but the early Armstrongs weren't. They were just a solid frame. And I looked at the picture and I say, we've got the drawings. I went, blimey, that's absolutely what it is. You can see it. It's got these massive 4-inch square timbers holding the walls up. Conformed completely. I mean, at some point it had the double door in the end. The early huts had this sort of 4-foot wide double door with sort of 2-foot sections which opened outwards. Opened inwards. But the basic frame was exactly as per the plan. And we had a bit of a chat, and obviously it was still covered with its original corrugated tin. A lot of it got the original Globe brand markings, which dated it, that particular logo dated it to, I think it was a pre-1914 brand. And I thought, well, this is quite odd, because we already knew that the corrugated tin was ordered to be removed late 1914 because it was, you know, as I say, it was more useful for other things, and timber was plentiful. So I drove home, and I got home, and I hadn't even got out of the car, and I just thought, this is really, really odd, because we know that the hut came from Cherry Hinton Venereal Disease Hospital, so we know what it was, but we now know that this hut is a very early Armstrong hut. It's covered in corrugated tin, which dates it probably no later than November, December 1914. And it doesn't make any sense, because that early on, the need was for accommodation. It wasn't for Army VD hospitals, you know, they just needed to get people out from underneath canvas. And then in an instance, went, hang about, because as you well know, my great passion in life was the Suffolk Regiment. And in 2017, earlier that year, Lindsay and I had been on a battlefield tour with Phil Kerm, who many years ago got really passionately obsessed by the 11th Battalion Suffolk Regiment, the Cam Suffolks, the fellows from Cambridge. I mean, you knew some of the Cam Suffolks. And we'd gone, and he said, well, it's the centenary. I haven't really done much about the 11th Suffolks for years, but I'm going to organise a tour, and we're going to go and we're going to visit all the main Cam Suffolk sites. So yeah, we'd love to do that. So we went on the tour with him. And on the sort of first day, he was just doing the sort of the overview, which was all fairly straightforward, you know, in the September of 1914, because the Cambridgeshire Regiment were purely territorial, and there was far more men than can join the Cambridgeshires. A lot of them had walked to Bury St Edmunds. They'd got to the Suffolk Regiment depot, which was already overflowing. They already couldn't cope, and they said, look, tell you what, get yourselves back to Cambridge, go to Cambridge Corn Exchange, and we'll send somebody. So they all get themselves back to Cambridge Corn Exchange. The following day, Suffolk Regiment Depot send a handful of officers and NCOs, which is the birth of the 11th Battalion. And as the battalion expands, they then get billeted in two schools, in Melbourne Road School and County School in Cambridge. And as I said earlier, you've got this massive problem that straight away you've got half the battalion in two different places. You've got to get them together, you've got to feed them, you've then got to train them, and then reverse the process. It's a waste, you know, it's a complete waste of the day. So the battalion, Phil was saying, the battalion commander then wrote to the War Office and said, we need a camp of our own, which is quite unusual. I mean, normally they were brigade camps, they were divisional camps. Not very common that you found battalions that had their own camp. I mean, we know that the Leeds Pals did, but that's all disappeared, that's all long gone. And he mentioned that it was built at Cherry Hinton in Cambridgeshire. So I then, there and then, I haven't got out of the car at this stage, I then Google and discover that, sure enough, that Cherry Hinton Camp was originally built for the 11th Suffolks. And when the 11th Suffolks then move up to Ripon to join the 34th Division, to begin with, they leave a few hundred men behind who become the embryonic 14th Battalion, which are their sort of drafting battalion. But when they leave, at that point, then it becomes an Army VD hospital. So suddenly, like, whoa, you know, we've now got an 11th Suffolk hut. How fantastic is that? Now, on the site, we wanted to have one hut, which was a barrack hut, exactly as it would have been. So you walk in the door, there's the 4 tables down the room, there's the 8 benches, there's the stove, all the hooks and shelves along the walls, and the 32 bed spaces and the NCO's room at the end. And when I say bed spaces, I mean, they weren't beds, they were low wooden trestles with 3 planks. I mean, that's what they were. Then during the day, that would all be pushed to the side to give you enough room to get around the table to eat your food, clean your kit. And because we've got quite a narrow site, we'd already decided that one of the later war 16-foot wide huts, which funnily enough we're in the process of putting up now, we were going to use that because it gave us 4 foot more space, because as I say, there's a bank with a field then a drop, a hut. We have to have 12.5 feet for emergency vehicles. There's another row of huts which then run at 90 degrees, and then there's a river, so it's finite. So I still haven't got out of the car. I ring up Kev and I said, you know that we're going to put that 16-foot hut as our barrack hut lengthways down by the bank? He said, yeah, there's not enough room to do anything else. I said, well, we're going to have to put this Girton hut there. Oh, no, can't possibly do that. There's not enough room. I said, hear me out. Let me just tell you what it is. So I explained what it is. It's an 11th Suffolk hut. And he goes quiet. And I said, where were you born? He went, Cherry Hinton, where it came from. I said, you had 2 uncles, didn't you, who'd served in the Suffolk Regiment Battalion in the First War. What battalion was that? the 11th. So I said, so there's literally a 1 in 30 chance that your uncles could have lived in this hut while they were training. And by the following morning, when I get to work, Kev and Harry are already digging out the bank and making it wide enough to fit the hut in. And it's fantastic because as they stripped it down, and they literally stripped it down into its component parts, Kev had decided that instead of, very often when they were moved quite crudely in the 20s, they would be chopped into 10-foot sections and then nailed together. They said, no, we're going to do this properly. So it was stripped literally into every individual piece of timber, reassembled. And because after the war, when you bought huts after the war, you could just buy it in its standard 60-foot by 20-foot form. Or if you wanted a bigger hut, you could buy bits of other huts. And so Girton Women's Institute had decided they wanted 10-foot more. So they bought a hut and 10-foot extra. So because we'd got 70 feet of material, Kev was able to use the extra 10 feet to repair the 60-foot hut. So virtually every piece of that is the original hut. The only thing that needed replacing in its entirety, they sit on a wooden rail that runs around the bottom, which was 4.5 inches by 4. And over the years, a century and a bit of damp had gradually eaten that away, but it had saved the rest, which is what it was intended to do. So replaced that, and it's all built on its proper concrete footings. And it's a remarkable piece of engineering. And we managed to find, very luckily, some 1980s army corrugated tin from a firing range, which hadn't been nailed at all. So it's as close as it could possibly be to the original. Half the windows are original. 2 sets of the doors are original. And we've got the original floor as well, but over a century, it's worn very, very thin in places. So we're going to have it'll have a wooden a sterling board floor then with the original boards nailed over the top. So you will walk on the original floor that the 11th Suffolks were walking on, but without falling through it. So by the time it's done, it will be probably the most original survivor, certainly one of the earliest. And the intention is that of those 32 bed spaces and the NCO's room at the end, every bed space will be identifiable as belonging to a soldier that served with the 11th at some point throughout the war. So there'll be blokes who joined at the outset who were then discharged because they're in reserved occupations or they weren't fit enough. There'll be men who were posted elsewhere. There'll be obviously quite a few who were killed or wounded on the first day on the Somme. Men who were killed or wounded at Rue Chemical Works. So obviously the 11th had a real battering there. Henning Hill, 1918, the German March offensive. Then they get moved for a rest up to the Ypres salient, where again they really have a battering when the Germans come crashing through in the April, with a lot of them killed and captured there, and the battalion's pretty much smashed apart at that stage. And of course, a lot of them who then come home, and some of whom were still going back. People who were still going back years later after the war, people you knew. So the idea is that we will tell the story of that battalion at war by the people who took part, with the rough proportion of all the men who served in it, the proportion of those who were killed, the proportion who came home, as far as we can work that out, so that it really gives you a sense. And of course, it is the story of the 11th Suffolks, but it's a kind of metaphor for most other units. Yeah. And I don't yet know how we'll do that, but I'm also very keen that it won't be full of explanations. We sort of thought this through and thought, well, sometimes you go into a really interesting museum or a stately home, and it's full of little captions that tell you what everything is. Well, we're really hoping it will be able to speak for itself. You'll walk in and you'll get it. You'll understand how it worked and why it worked. So that's that's the Baraka. Anyway, we've got lots of interesting ideas for all the others, but that's just it's out of all of them, I think that's the one that so far is our favourite.
It's fascinating. How many have you got there then now?
Well, we've got planning permission for 11.
Wow.
And it was quite funny because, again, the planning officer said at the start, oh, well, why don't you apply for permission for 2? You'll never get permission for 11. And we sort of thought, well, if they're prepared to give us permission for 2, well, why wouldn't they give us permission for 11? So we just, we can fit 11 in. So that's what we applied for permission for. And like I say, they were going to be replicas. But we're very, very lucky. The planning department at Bury St Edmunds have been incredibly helpful. When we said to them, look, originally they were all going to be the same size pretty much when they were going to be replica. Now they're all different shapes and sizes because they're real, and they've said, well, we'll support it. If they're real huts, then you need to build them at the size that they are. And very, very lucky as well with the building regulations department, because obviously if you just said, well, I'm just going to build an old hut, then they'd say, well, you can't do this and you can't do that. But because it's a heritage project, they've been prepared to look and see that we've built it in exactly the right way. We've got plans for them. and they're happy with what we're doing, and they said, well, you know, we let you do things that we wouldn't let a normal builder do, because clearly you're restoring them as they were, and 100 years on, they were still standing. So clearly they'd been made properly in the first place. So that's all very fortunate. So far, as I say, we've got that big double recreation hut where so far we've had exhibitions. We had Tim Fox Godden's art exhibition, Mesh Theatre staged a production of The Soldier, the story of Rupert Brooke. We've had all sorts of talks and lectures and film shows. We screened the silent Battle of the Somme film with proper piano accompaniment in there. So it's great. It's now a proper living space. It's come back to life as it would have been, with people laughing and cheering and applause and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, brilliant.
Which is just wonderful. We've got a guard room, which started life as an original officers' accommodation hut at the Royal Naval Air Service Aerodrome at Aldeburgh. That had been a bungalow after the war. It had been sold off in 1921, taken up to the local village of Friston on handcarts. There was a lady whose mother remembered it being brought up there, and turned into a bungalow. And it had a bedroom extended on the back one side. It had a bathroom put on the back in the 80s, a kitchen in the 60s or something like that. So all the back windows had gone, and one of the front windows was quite rotten. So we thought, well, what we've got is the basics of a guard room, because if we keep the two windows and we put the door in the middle, we put the veranda on it using the original drawings, and so we created a guard room. And again, it's a very, very different style. I mean, the Royal Naval Air Service, their huts were incredibly thin. They used very, very thin framing, very narrow boarding, and the windows very, very different again. The windows were sort of stuck in with putty rather than then fixed in with beading. Quite extraordinary to see all these differences and how they were made. So that now you go onto the veranda, you go into the door, the right-hand side, or 2/3 of it, we've recreated that as a guard room, pretty much as it would have been, with the beds, with the cell, the guard commander's desk. It's got the original safe in there from the King's Royal Rifle Corps at Winchester, which I bought from. I bought that from,
funds still in it as well.
Yeah, I bought that from Nick Hall at Sabre Sales in the 80s, and I've got just the thing for you. I've got the guardroom safe from the King's Royal Rifle Corps at Winchester. You really need to buy this. And I bought it, and it's sat in my parents' garage ever since. And what on earth am I going to do with this? And eventually we built a guardroom to put it in. So, so that's, and we're very keen. We want to try and make it exactly how a guardroom would have been. It's got the stove in there and all the other things. Because very often there's a tendency in sort of with heritage buildings that they kind of get overdone. It's almost like you get the art director from a film in and say, right, I need to just fill this with stuff, and it'll have stacks of leather suitcases and all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. But we've got, I think it's a 1921 list of what there would have been in a guard room of a camp of that size, a small camp. So there would have been no hospitals. So the guard room had a stretcher with a pair of the stretcher straps. We know how many brooms it would have had. We know how many coal scuttles and coal buckets and all that kind of thing. So we're gradually accumulating all of that. And then the other half the other third, which would have been the orderly room, that will be the place where we tell the story of the original hut building project of 1914, 1919, and that incredible, massive engineering project that sort of, as I say, in its initial form, enough accommodation for 800,000 men, let alone what then happens in France, the Lonica, you name it, where they're transporting huts and rebuilding them.
Yeah, they were everywhere, weren't they? Everywhere.
Absolutely, quite incredible. What always fascinates me is that in the March Offensive, the YMCA were literally just getting volunteers, dismantling huts, and believe us, we know what that takes, and moving them back 20 miles and reassembling them so the fellas could carry on having cups of tea and buns. I mean, it's quite a remarkable undertaking. Yeah, so we'll tell that story, and we will also tell the story of the 11 huts that we've got, their social history, where they've come from. We've got some fantastic artifacts that we found. I think Mendlesham Scout Hut had got an original Christmas card that had been pinned underneath the boards by the fellas that had assembled it. In the roof in the garden, the matchboarding that, which came off the wall in another hut, and just as Kev was painting it, he spotted a pair of cross flags that had been drawn, obviously, by the signallers by their bunk. We've got a couple of original sheets of asbestos, because a lot of the original huts were covered in asbestos lining, and we went to look at a hut at Outwell near Wisbeach, and it was beyond hope. I mean, one of the roof trusses was hanging down in the middle, the floor had all gone. And we said to the lady, I'm really sorry, but much as we would love to save this, it's beyond help. And just as we were walking out, she said, what did you think of my drawings? Drawings? What drawings? So we sort of picked our way back in and kept saying, look at this. And there were only 2 of the original asbestos sheets left in there, one of which had got soldiers' names and addresses. The other one had got little cartoons of soldiers. And there's a drummer with his peak cap and his corporal stripes. And so I thought, well, we really ought to rescue those. So we went back again, suited and booted, and sealed them all up. And eventually they will be in the guardroom, but obviously sealed behind glass. Because, again, it's an important part of the story. In 1914, a lot of the early huts were completely lined with sheets of asbestos. The army stopped using them quite quickly because they're brittle, they're very heavy, they're awkward to transport. But what's fascinating is that after the war, when a lot of these were turned into bungalows, it was a selling point, that the builders would take a 60-foot hut and basically turn it into a 40-foot bungalow. With 10-foot panels down the side, you'd take the end 2 10-foot panels and you would turn them in, so you end up with windows all the way around, and then you chose where you wanted your front and back door. And then it was lined with sheets of asbestos, and it was sold as your house is now fireproof.
It's like a Channel 4 building programme.
Yeah, exactly. And we were quite lucky, actually, because one of the other huts we got quite early on was from Brockton. Brockton in Staffordshire, obviously Cannock Chase, 2 massive camps, and we were very keen that we wanted at least one hut that had come from one of the proper divisional camps. And we were just lucky. We spotted on Facebook that there was I think a Cannock Chase site, and someone had said, "Oh, look, this hut had been used as a bungalow. It had come from Brockton camp, only moved probably a quarter of a mile down into Brockton village, and the neighbours had bought it." I think it only ever had 2 families in since the war, but the neighbours had bought it and were going to knock it down and build a bungalow or extend their garden or whatever. And what was fascinating was that Stafford Council, who completely get how important their First War heritage is, had said, you can't pull it down. You need to find somebody who will take it and restore it. And so 2 years on, nobody had wanted it, so it still sat there. They'd then gone back to the Stafford planners and said, what can we do with it now? And they'd said, okay, you can take it down, but you're going to have to store it for 2 years in case someone wants it, and let them have it. So we got to hear about this just before that process had started. Luckily, what they had done, they had all of the asbestos removed. So all the interior had been, all the asbestos had been taken away. So when we rang up and said, "Oh, is there any chance we could have it?" They were like, "Oh, yes, please come and take it." So we went and dismantled the whole thing, took it all away, and that currently that's Kev's workshop where he repairs the other huts. But soon it will be part of the pretty much the 1915 display. So it'll be part of the 6 huts that tell a sort of roughly chronological story of the war, and the workshop will move elsewhere. But again, very, very different design. Instead of having separate roof trusses sitting on top of the wall with the roof on, it has that sort of Victorian idea of a spine board that runs down the centre of the roof with 2 boards sort of leaning up against it, each one braced all the way down the hut. So again, very, very different design, which we've seen certainly in other places. So again, all part of that learning process. And then the hut that we're in the process of putting up at the moment, again, another late war hut, so made in 6-foot sections instead of 10-foot sections. So as the war progresses, they become in smaller chunks. So you need less people to put them up. Suddenly, probably a team of 6 men could put that up rather than the team of 20 or 30 you needed to put up the original Armstrongs, or probably 20 men that you needed to put up the ones like Brockton made in 10-foot sections. And this one is 72 feet long. It had been, we don't know its original origins. I'm guessing it probably came from Colchester because it's a very similar design to the double one, but in its single form. It had gone to Stowmarket in 1947 for the Army Cadets, and there was some fantastic graffiti inside it, and also other stuff that I couldn't possibly repeat. Nicknames of the soldiers. We know the men who put it up, but only by their incredibly rude nicknames. And it had got an armoury at one end, and all of the walls had been packed with sawdust to absorb moisture to stop the weapons going rusty. And so what we're going to do, then Stowmarket Girl Guides had then bought it off the army in 1968 or 67 when the TA was reformed, and Stowmarket Guides had it ever since. And so the first 20 odd feet will be our changing exhibition space. The rest of it will then become Kev's workshop, where not only is he restoring huts, but all sorts of other stuff. We've got a German 77mm field gun.
Wow.
that he's got in process, which had been a war trophy that came from a scrapyard in Wales. He's already restored an original 1880s grindstone, because again, in in the part where we talk about mobilisation, the original mobilisation orders for 2nd Battalion Suffolk Regiment at Curragh Camp, Dublin, which literally lists every single thing that's going to happen for the 4 days of mobilisation. Who's doing what, where, when, what they need to do it with, what time. On the first day of mobilisation at 6 o'clock in the morning, the armourer goes to the quartermaster and draws the grindstone for sharpening bayonets, and actually as a metaphor for going from peace to war, the grindstone for sharpening bayonets is right up there. And we were very lucky that an old armourer friend, John Oxlade, was moving to Spain when he sold his film and television weapons hire business, and he said, "Oh, I've got just the thing for you fellas," and we took the van over to his workshop and sat outside. There was this wonderful old, as I say, I think it's 1880s or 1890s grindstone, but it's certainly the thing for the job. And as I say, Kev's restored that. Currently, he's got what's he got on the operating table at the moment? An original 2-inch trench howitzer, which is all of the framing. The base is all original. He's made a replica of the tube and the wooden base. But again, it's lovely. It's it's nice to see these things coming back to life again. So yeah, the workshop's going to be very busy, I suspect, even once all the huts are up.
Fascinating. I mean, an absolute treasure trove. I mean, how can people come and see what you do?
Well, I mean, what we do, because obviously there are a handful of planning conditions that we still need to finish before we get it open every day, and obviously people say to me, "When's it going to be open?" And I say, "Well, probably 5 years ago, really, because when it was going to be replicas, it would have been straightforward. We just built replicas." The heritage project is much more time consuming, it's much more expensive, so it's slowed everything down. Obviously this year has been a nightmare. The hut we're putting up at the moment should have been put up in April with a team of volunteers, which obviously didn't happen. We've got a volunteers weekend booked in for October, which again we've had to cancel, so the boys, the sort of the regular volunteers who are always here, they are currently putting that up, so at least we've made some progress this year, but we were hoping to have got 2 up this year. So what we do, we are open things like Heritage Open weekends. We take bookings from club societies, our Western Front Association groups, family history groups, all sorts of heritage groups, not just heritage groups. I mean, the Ferguson Tractor Club had their AGM here a couple of years ago, and the chairman was so impressed that he's given us a Ferguson tractor for use on the site. So all sorts of people come. And what's lovely as well, I mean, when we do these sort of annual Heritage Open weekends, very often the same people come year after year. I said, you have heard me say all this before. And they say, yeah, but every year we come, it's got bigger, it's got better, there's more. Because when it first started, I think we thought that we had to get everything finished before we could open properly. And Richard Van Emden said to me, no, you've got that completely wrong. He said, I was a student at Durham in the 80s. He said, and I used to go to Beamish, the big open air museum. And back in the 80s, there wasn't too much there, but what was there was great. He said, but every time I go back, there's a bit more of it and it gets a bit better. But more important than any of that, I've been on that journey with them. I've seen it get bigger and better. I've seen it improve. I've seen it how it's come along, and I feel part of that. And so that's our intention. If we can probably get one more hut up, start getting interesting artifacts in it. And I mean, Kevin and I have been collecting this stuff for many, many years. We've got some brilliant things to put on display. So I think that will be the point when we open the door properly. But at the moment, if a group of people want to come, or sometimes people ring up and say, I'm here from Australia. Someone tells me that I really should come and have a look. We'll always find the time and put the kettle on, and people can come and have a wander around.
Brilliant.
And obviously there are various events that we put on throughout the year, well, throughout most years. So yeah, I mean, I think that's as we're still in this process, we're always very happy to have groups come, and sometimes we'll have 2 or 3 Western Front Association groups who all arrange to come on the same day, which is great. So we get more people, and so you only need to tell them once instead of 3 times.
But I think you're online with Twitter and Facebook.
Yes, yes.
And also you've been doing some fantastic myth-busting lectures on YouTube recently through it as well, which has been very interesting.
Yes, I mean, obviously, what do you do in lockdown when you can't do what you would normally do? Well, yeah, as you've been doing, it's all about a bit of outreach, and this has been great for us. It's given us the opportunity to find new audiences, to find people who knew nothing about us, and to tell them stuff. And it's like, well, what yes, I can talk about battles, I can talk about all sorts of stuff, but what's going to make people sort of stop in the tracks and go, oh, that's really interesting, these people have got something worth saying. So I've really been sort of thinking about what can we say to people that's going to make them stop and think, and oh, this is interesting, I want to hear more about what these people have got to say. So that's really what's driven the series of talks. let's tell people something that they might not know or not be familiar with, or they might know a little bit about, and expand that knowledge. So that's really what we've been trying to do. And we've launched those every month on I think the second Wednesday in theory, sort of roughly in the evening, at the same time that we've been having our sort of Suffolk Western Front Association branches. So there've been like a virtual meeting where people who would normally have come to Stowmarket, British Legion Club, sat down for a talk, have had that sort of communal experience. They still come there, they sit down in their own living room and they watch a talk. And of course it's open to everybody else as well. And we've had fantastic response from it. And obviously, you know, what we're after subscribers really. So anybody who would like to hear them, obviously you can just log on to the Great War Huts YouTube site, but subscribe as well, because it's, as you know, it's all about subscribers. It's a great benefit to us the more subscribers we get, and also you sort of think, well, this is good. People want to hear more, and it's quite inspiring.
Absolutely. Well, Taff, thank you so much for telling us all about Great War Huts and what you're doing. I'll put some links on the podcast website to your various social media channels and also your YouTube channel. Taff, that's brilliant. Thanks so much. And we'll get you back again to talk about film and TV work, which I know is something very dear to you and something that interests a lot of people. So thanks for that, Taff.
That's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe to us via your favourite podcast service. Tell us what you think using the hashtag #OldFrontLine. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcore, and the podcast has its own Twitter feed now at OldFrontLinePod. And have a look at the podcast websites oldfrontline.co.uk. Until we meet again, along the Old Front Line.